All right. So welcome back to Great Debates, Great Decisions, and Great Deciders. It is a true pleasure to be back learning together as a group. We have covered, we've now, by the way, been on this series of Great Debates, Great Decisions, Great Deciders for more than a year now. It's now been more than a year. We started right after Yom Kippur last year, and we have covered a number of different fascinating topics together. The development of halacha, the development of the Mishnah and the Gemara. When we were discussing Hanukkah times, we discussed Amalek. We've discussed the state of Israel, and most recently we've been discussing a lot of great debates, great decisions, and great deciders regarding the coronavirus pandemic and a number of different fascinating topics. So it is great that we are back together again. The next mini series is going to be the Great D's, Great Debates about the Mussar movement, which we'll, of course, discuss at great length and give an introduction and overview of exactly what the next 3 weeks are going to look like. But I would like to ask everyone, if you could please, those that are here live and those that listen online, if you could please share with me any ideas of potential future series that you would like to go through in this context of great debates, great decisions, great deciders. Whether it be a different a specific type of Torah personality, specific Torah personalities, or other movements in the Torah world, positions, whatever it might be, please let me know so that I could prepare a lesson accordingly. Something that I had in mind, and a couple of people approached me about, of potentially doing a series on minhagim, customs, not getting into necessarily going through every single custom under the sun, but rather the concept of customs and how they interplay with halacha, how they play into the system of Jewish law. The weight that our customs carry. So that was a suggested series that came to me, but please share any suggestions you may have, and hopefully the more that we collect, so then it will give us great material for another fantastic year of learning together on Wednesday nights. Tonight, I want to begin our Great D's series on the Mussar movement, really giving a the title of this general Wednesday night class we've been doing is Great Debates, Great Decisions, Great Deciders. So for Mussar, we're going to move the opposite way. We're going to start with the Great Deciders, then go into the Great Decision, and then the Great Debate. The Great Deciders, meaning the influencers of the Mussar movement, who are the major players in the Mussar movement. Of course, we're going to introduce it by defining what is Mussar in a moment. Then next week, hopefully, we'll discuss the Great Decision, why Rabbi Yisrael Salanter began the Mussar movement, the impact that the Mussar movement had and has today, and the ultimate ultimate differences that came as a result of the Mussar movement, and how those differences apply today. And lastly, in a couple weeks from now, we'll discuss the Great Debate, whether or not the study of Mussar is something that was accepted by everyone, whether or not the study of Mussar is a good thing to do or not a good thing to do. We're talking like, yeah, of course. What do you mean? The study of Mussar, of course, is a good thing to do. So for us to discuss the approach to Mussar and to whether or not it's even something we should be doing in the first place, that will save for the very last class, the controversy of the Mussar movement. But just let's just define what is Mussar, what is the study of Mussar, and we'll get to its founder, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, in a moment. I was once visiting Rav Hershel Shechter Shlita, my Rabbi, the Posek Hador. Rav Hershel Shechter every summer goes up to the mountains in the Catskill Mountains of New York. He has a small summer home up there in Tannersville, New York. Tannersville, New York. His house is one of the most incredible sights to see. It's a small little house. I think they have probably 2 bedrooms. They have a small kitchenette, a Shabbos table, a nice outdoor lawn, as many homes in upstate New York do, and maybe a couch or two in the living area. And that's the whole house. And the house, when you walk into it in the summer, it is stacked with Sfarim, open. It is an unbelievable thing. Basically, Rav Shechter every year for the summer, he is in different places, but he always carves out at least 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, to go up to Tannersville, literally just to learn Torah. He doesn't do anything else except for learn Torah. He likes to joke. He says that 49 or 50 weeks of the year I spend entertaining, and I learn for 2 weeks of the year. It's half a joke. I mean, his whole year he spent teaching and involved in every aspect of Jewish life from a leadership standpoint, and his time to learn is really spent in the summer during those 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks that he's in Tannersville, New York, he brings a chavrusa with him, and I heard from his chavrusa that Rav Shechter goes through about 100 daf of Shas over those 2 weeks in depth, which, just to put in scale, daf yomi, which is too fast of a pace for me, and even those that learn daf yomi will tell you that it's probably too fast of a pace for them. But the advantage of going through 1 daf a day is something that outweighs the fact that it is a very quick pace, and you don't necessarily get every single thing out of the daf every single day. But doing 1 daf a day takes you 7.5 years to complete, and even that is a relatively quick pace, learning through all of Shas in 7.5 years. Rav Shechter, over the course of 2 weeks, learns 100 daf, and that is in depth. He literally just sits there for 20 hours a day learning. So I once went with a group of friends of mine to go visit Rav Shechter in the summer, and we were sitting outdoors and having a nice lunch together. And we're going around asking Rav Shechter different questions, either questions in Jewish law, Jewish practice. And I asked Rav Shechter, I said, Rebbe, aside for my regular curriculum that, in my regular schedule of learning, what would be a good thing for me to learn? So he thinks for a moment and he says, well, it's always good to review Shas, to review the entire Talmud. So I responded to him. I said, hold on one second. I meant like aside for Talmud, right? Meaning that's what I spend my day learning. I spend my day learning Talmud or Jewish law. This is while I was still in my preparatory stages, but I was learning to become a rabbi, right? This is what I spent my whole day doing. So I meant, no, like in my downtime, when I have free time. He said, yeah, I know. In your free time, you should learn more Talmud, learn more Gemara. I said, okay, well, is there anything else? Any other books that maybe I should learn? And really, I thought that my question was a pretty obvious one. I was basically asking, what Mussar Sfarim should I learn? What books in Jewish law, in Jewish ethics, should I be learning? Pirkei Avos. Should I be learning Derech Hashem? Should I be learning the writings of the Ramchal, the writings of Rabbeinu Bachaya, the writings of Maimonides in philosophy, works that really, get to the heart and soul of Jewish ethics? And his response to me when I clarified my question was, I read through the Mesilat Yesharim one time and I thought it was very nice. Like, he downplayed this whole concept of studying Mussar. And it always is something that struck me of, how is it possible that you, Rav Shechter, who is the definition of an upstanding, upright, ethical, moral individual, leaving out everything he proactively does for other people, but just he himself is a person of pristine character, a person it's almost like he's robotic in how good of a person he is and how straight he is. And I assumed that the only way to do that would be if you study Mussar, if you study ethics, if you study philosophy. By doing that, and you actively work on your character refinement, that is how you become a person like that. Until I actually looked into the Mussar movement and looked into what Rabbi Salanter was trying to get people to accomplish. So who was Rabbi Yisrael Salanter? Who was this individual that was the founder of the Mussar movement? So he's known by Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, but his name is Rabbi Yisrael Lipkin. His last name is Lipkin. He is from the town of Salanter. He was born in 1809 and died in 1883. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, he took on a number of different jobs in rabbinics. He held the position of a Rav in the 1930s and 1940s in different towns in Europe. He studied under Rav Zundel Salant, who was a student of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, who was, a student of the Volozhin Yeshiva, the founder of Volozhin Yeshiva. When we had a whole series in great debates about the Volozhin Yeshiva, we learned about how Reb Chaim of Volozhin founded the Volozhin Yeshiva, founded the Yeshiva Eitz Chaim. He had a number of famous students. One of them was Rav Zundel Salant, and he had a student, Rabbi, at the time was Yisrael Lipkin, later became a rabbi. He was a rabbi of a number of different communities, had great influence, but his greatest contribution to the Torah world was when he was an acting rabbi, and this is in the 1850s. And he saw a major issue going on, which was the Haskalah movement. The Haskalah movement was the Enlightenment movement, a movement that ran from the mid 1770s through, till the end of the 19th century. Was the motivation for the Volozhin Yeshiva, was a motivation for a number of other yeshivas in Europe. But it was an uphill battle. It was a very difficult battle. It was a philosophical battle. And basically, the Enlightenment movement, the Haskalah movement, essentially tried to show through philosophical, not so much theological argument, more philosophical argument, trying to poke holes in Jewish education that people grew up with at the time. And there were yeshivas established to try and combat the Haskalah movement and to raise people that would become that they themselves would become soldiers in the battle against this Haskalah movement, because as the Jewish community in Eastern Europe continued to grow in size, but in holding on to traditions, in holding on to the values, in holding on to their true Jewish way of life, that was dwindling in numbers due to the Haskalah movement and due to the Enlightenment movement. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, looking around in the 1850s, saw that this was not sustainable. You can create 100 different yeshivas. You can learn the greatest Talmud in the world, but Talmud is not what is going to combat is not what's going to combat the Enlightenment movement. What's going to combat the Enlightenment movement, what's going to combat people straying away from their Torah values, is if a person truly understands not what Jewish values are, but why we adhere to Torah values. where Rabbi Salanter wanted to create a system, and it was supposed to be a system, and one that was supposed to not just take off in the yeshiva world, but one that was going to take off in every Jewish home. He wanted to create a system where a person can get to the core of why it is so critical to adhere to Torah and Torah values on two fronts. Number one, basic Jewish philosophy and foundation, that a person needs to know the fundamental aspects of what it means to be a Jew, which is something that was not necessarily discussed. Your relationship with God was not necessarily discussed in yeshivas. In yeshivas, you learned what God wants from you, and you did those things. No one in the right mind who was studying in yeshiva would violate Shabbos, but no one knew why they wouldn't violate Shabbos. No one in their right mind, when they were studying yeshiva, would ever eat non-kosher, but no one knew why they wouldn't eat non-kosher. Rabbi Salanter wanted that the average Jew should understand the fundamental aspects of Judaism, not just the what, but the why. The second purpose of learning, or it's not really learning, it's more developing that side of your character and that side of your academic growth, said Rabbi Salanter, is so that a person can become solid and confident in who they are. Once a person understands their values and understands their principles, it's one thing to know your principles in your mind, but it's another thing to be confident in your principles in the face of someone challenging them. And that is what he wanted to accomplish through the quote unquote study of Mussar, the engagement in Mussar. Now, Rabbi Salanter obviously wasn't the person who invented the study of Mussar. We already, or what Mussar is in general, which we'll translate lightly as character development. We already have in the Torah. The Torah talks about a person being disciplined. Of course, Shlomo HaMelech wrote Mussar Sfarim. He wrote works dedicated for a person to become disciplined. Probably the greatest example of which is Mishlei, and I'll share my screen over here. Where we see how Shlomo HaMelech wrote a work dedicated specifically for Mussar. Says the pasuk in Mishlei, opening pasuk in Mishlei, Mishlei Shlomo ben David Melech Yisrael. These are the proverbs of Shlomo, the son of David, the king of Israel. Pasuk Beis, Lada'as Chachma, to know wisdom, U Mussar, and to be disciplined, Lahavin Imre Bina, in order to comprehend God's words. Lakachas Mussar Haskel, in order to apply your discipline in your mind. Tzedek umishpat umesharim, so you could have justiceness, righteousness, justice, and have integrity, be upright, be yashar. Shlomo Melech dedicated an entire work, continuing in pasuk Ches, Shema beni Mussar avicha, that a person needs to take the discipline of their father, V'al titosh Torat imecha, in order so that they do not leave the Torah of their mother. This is not something that was invented by Rabbi Salanter, but this is something that was systemized by Rabbi Salanter and made something of critical importance by Rabbi Salanter. He was a revolutionary in the sense that he said it's not enough for us to just learn the Torah and that through the Torah you'll figure out how to be a good person, but a person needs to be methodical in how they develop their character, how they grow as a person, and how they get themselves on the straight and narrow path. Rabbi Salanter had a number of students. He had a number of students that took these teachings of the Mussar movement and ran with it and opened up their own yeshivas. Namely, these three major students that he had were Rav Naftali Amsterdam, who lived from 1832 to 1916. He had Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer, was probably his most prized student. He wrote a sefer called the Pri Yitzchak, which is a responsa on Jewish law, and he lived from 1837 to 1907. And Rav Simcha Zisel of Ziv, also known as the Alter of Kelm, who passed away in 1898. We'll get back to those individuals in a moment, but I want to just take a look for a moment, and I apologize, I don't have it in the screen share because I was not able to find a copy of it online. But I have with me the Sefer Or Yisrael. Or Yisrael is a collection of writings that were from Rabbi Salanter. The first half of the work are really writings that he wrote, letters he wrote to students. Students would ask him questions, and these are his responsa that he would send to them. The questions were, one, focused primarily on personal development and growth, character development. You know, Rav Moshe Feinstein once complained, you know, everyone all over the world and certainly in the United States would send all of their questions to Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein was the address for all halachic inquiries, anything in Jewish law that needed clarification, needed a decision made. It went to Rav Moshe Feinstein. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, though, once complained when someone asked him, you know, what is the most commonly asked question that you get? So I forgot exactly what his answer was, if it was in the laws of Shabbos or the laws of building an Eruv, the laws of Pesach, Kashrus, whatever the question, whatever his answer was. But then he said, well, what bothers me are not the questions I get most asked, but the questions I get asked most infrequently, the questions I don't get asked. And it bothers me that I don't get asked these questions more. What are the questions that he felt as though he wasn't getting enough of? How is one supposed to develop a closer relationship with God? How is one supposed to be a better husband, a better father, a better friend, a better neighbor? How is one supposed to daven better? How is one supposed to learn better? These were questions that he wished he was getting more of, not because he felt as though he was the one that can give the right answers to it, but he felt that it was a shame that not enough people were asking these questions, meaning that not enough people were grappling with these issues. They were more concerned about whether or not their chicken was kosher than whether or not the way they treat people is kosher. Rabbi Salanter has a whole collection of questions that were sent to him specifically about how a person can better themselves. But then what I'm more interested in is a very small section in the middle of this work, this big, large 500-page volume, Or Yisrael. There's a small section in the middle that's about 15 pages, right over here. This small section right over here is about 15 pages that has a letter. This letter is called the Igeres HaMussar, the essay about Mussar. Now, while Rabbi Salanter was alive, he did not publish anything on his own. He didn't publish a sefer. He didn't publish any halachic works. He did publish a few articles, actually, in a Torah journal that he started called, it's right over here, called Sefer Tivuna. This was a Torah journal that Rabbi Salanter was the editor-in-chief of. And so he had a few halachic writings in here, but he did not publish any other works except for the Igeres HaMussar. What's the Igeres HaMussar? This was his Mussar manifesto. This was his declaration, his charge to the Jewish people about the importance of focusing yourself in your own personal growth and your relationship with God. Again, in order to accomplish those two things, that a person should know what their Jewish principles are, and be confident in those Jewish principles. I want to read for you the introduction to this short little 10-page letter that he published. Says Rabbi Salanter the following: Ha'adam chafzi b'dimyano v'asur b'muskalo. That a person is free in their dimyon, in their imagination, which basically means their habitual nature. That we humans in general are creatures of habit, and we just act freely without really thinking about what we do. But the things that tie us down, when we actually stop and consider what we're doing, that is not when we're using our habitual side of our personalities, the habitual side of our character, but rather it's when we use our brain, obviously, when we stop and think, right? When we think, that is what ties us down. Dimyono molicho shovev baderech. That a person's dimyon, their imagination, will lead them wildly astray. Lev ritzona, wherever their heart desires. Bal yechat me'ha'asid havadai. He writes in such a poetic and a flowery way. He says, lest a person even consider for a moment what the ultimate future is going to bring. What's he referring to? He's referring to Olam Haba. He's referring to the next world. That if we stopped and considered the next world, if we stopped and considered basically what's truly important in life, so then we wouldn't just let our imagination run wild, we would use our minds more. Eis yifkod Hashem al kol mifalav ubeshvatim kashim yivaser. That God is going to judge and give very severe punishment and judgment. Bal yilached zar biglalo. And he's going to think that, oh, you know what? It's really not me that's going to be judged. It's someone else, basically putting the blame on other people. Why we are? It's my mother's fault. It's my father's fault the way I am. Not a person not taking responsibility for their own actions. He writes, "Hu levado yisa pri chet-o," that a person, no, you have to argue back on your imagination, on your demon, and say, no, I am the one that carries and bears and carries the fruit of my own sin. Continues in his very strong language. Again, this is the introduction to why a person needs to learn Mussar. He writes the following. He says, "Miyadenuhu," but it's in our hands. It's in our hands to combat this dimyon, a person's imagination, their free spirit. How does a person do that? Bikochenu la'archiko. It's up to us to guide it. And he uses a beautiful imagery. He says that a person should lahaskil al davar emes. You should contemplate what's true. Manase. So what is a person going to do? Hadimyon nachil shotef v'aseichel yitava. That if a person lets their dimyon, lets their imagination run wild, essentially what that looks like, he says, think about it. He says like a raging sea, or like a very strong current through a river. And your dimyon, your imagination is just flowing. It's flowing. You let yourself just do without stopping and thinking. What happens? Your seichel becomes drowned. It drowns in it. And then even when you do want to use your seichel, it becomes more difficult to use your seichel because you're so drowned in your dimyon, in your imagination. Im lo nolichenu ba'aniyah. However, if someone were to throw a life preserver and say, seichel, grab on, and you let the seichel grab onto the life preserver, pull it out and pull it onto a ship, so then what happens? Now the person is floating on the ship, and a person can guide away from the treacherous waters until they are actually leading where the ship is going to go. But if you stop leading the ship, what happens again? It goes with the current again, until you get control of the ship and you send it back in the direction you want it to go in. Im lo no'cheli ba'aniyah, hi rekshes hanefesh v'saras haruach. That what is the boat? Mussar. Stopping and contemplating, thinking. Rabbi Salanter used to encourage his students to not just simply learn through the works of, let's say, the Ramban, Nachmanides, Maimonides, the Mesilas Yesharim, to learn through these works of Mussar, these works of ethical teachings. And you go to the shul library, you'll see scores, dozens, hundreds even, volumes of different Mussar Sfarim. The Satmar Rebbe used to say that the greatest Mussar Sefer of all is Chumash Devarim, the fifth of the 5 books of Moses. There is so much literature in ethics, in Jewish ethics, in proper morale, in character development. There's so much literature. You can't read it like you read any book. You can't just read the Mesilas Yesharim. You can't study the Mesilas Yesharim. You have to contemplate the Mesilas Yesharim. You have to stop for just a few minutes every day and just stop and think. Put your mind on the ship and direct the ship. Because we're living in a world where there are these vast currents all around us that it's so easy to get trapped in our habitual nature. I mean, it's human nature in and of itself. And then when you're living in a world like the world we're living today, it becomes so easy to fall back into the trap. So Rabbi Salanter said that you have to actually feel as if you're taking your mind and grabbing control over it. You're grabbing the reins over it. You're grabbing the wheel again. You are in control. And he would encourage his students to actually do exercises like this. Like, I'll give you an example. Rabbi Salanter would say that when a person should eat, he would say that, when a person eats, like, let's say, for example, if I'm thirsty, so what am I going to do? I'm just going to pick up my coffee and take a sip. Rabbi Salanter would encourage a person that instead of while you're working, while you're teaching, while you are learning, while you are out with a friend, while you are in your law office, accounting firm, hospital, playing golf or whatever it may be, and you feel your mouth get a little dry, a little parched, so habitually you just pick up a glass of water and you drink it. Rabbi Salanter would say that when a person goes to pick it up, they bring it closer to the mouth, and you should purposely stop and think for a moment. I am thirsty, and therefore I'm going to take a drink, which sounds crazy. Like, who lives like that, right? And it actually could become a little dangerous. I know of people that, literally drove themselves sick because they attempted to do this and they weren't necessarily ready for it. They lived life for like a full week like that. Before they would open a door, they would stop and think to themselves, I'm opening this door because I want to walk inside, right? Like, it's just not the way that people live. I'm turning on my car because I want to drive to the supermarket. I am going to the supermarket because I need to get groceries. But Rabbi Salanter was saying that in small doses, doing things like this, it is just a way of training your mind to be a more thoughtful person, to be a thought out person, to be a person that actually can consider why I do what I do, which is such an important thing. I mean, if I'm going to do it for coffee, so then eventually I'm going to do it every time I open a siddur, and every time I hear the Torah being read, and every time I hear a powerful message from a rabbi or a teacher, and every time I get paid and I receive a paycheck, I'm going to actually stop and consider where that came from, that it actually came from the Rabbanu Shalom. That the more a person trains their mind to be like this, they become a different person. So this is Rabbi Salanter. Let's just get to, as we close, to some of Rabbi Salanter's students, and we'll close with an amazing story about Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer. So we said that Rabbi Salanter had 3 major students: Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam, Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer, and Rabbi Simcha Zitzel Ziv. Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam had a couple of students. He had one of his students was the Alter of Navardik, and also the Alter of Slobodka. The Alter of Navardik took Mussar in a very different direction than the Alter of Slobodka. The Alter of Slobodka was Rav Nassan Tzvi Finkel, and they took the study of Mussar in two very different directions, which we'll discuss probably more in depth when we get to the next week, about really the different aspects of the Mussar movement and what different ones represented. But that's Rabbi Rav Naftali Amsterdam, who later, along with the Alter of Kelm, Rav Simcha Zisel Ziv, started the Beis HaMussar, which was a house, an institute in Jerusalem, that was focused on continuing the legacy of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. What they wanted to do was to create the study of Mussar into a much more methodical study, and one that they would popularize in yeshivas. So that was Rav Simcha Zisel Ziv and Rav Naftali Amsterdam. They really continued the legacy of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer, although he was not as involved in the continuation of the legacy of Mussar, he was an extremely close student of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and one that really took note of all of his Rebbe's teachings, would spend a lot of time in the study of Mussar. But that's not what he was famous for. What he was famous for was being one of the greatest poskim, one of the greatest halachic deciders to ever live, which usually the two don't go together. Usually you have, let's say in a yeshiva setting, you have a Rosh Yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva is usually the person who is the biggest Talmud Chacham in the yeshiva, person who their breadth and depth of in Talmud study is something that is notable. It's something that is something that the students aspire to. And then you have the religious guidance counselor, the spiritual guidance counselor, and that is the mashgiach. And that is a person who, yes, they're a Talmud Chacham, but are more focused on the Mussar side of things, character development, helping the students grow into, and that was part of what Rav Simcha Zisel Ziv and Rav Naftali Amsterdam established for yeshivas, this concept of there's a mashgiach and a Rosh Yeshiva. But Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer was someone who was so heavily steeped in the Mussar movement. He is literally one of the closest students of the founder of the movement, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and yet he became this great halachic mind, this great Talmud Chacham, like unprecedented levels. He was one of the Gedolei Hador. So someone once approached Rav Yisrael Salanter, and they said to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, they said, okay, we understand why it's important for the average person to learn Mussar. Okay, we get it, right? Because a person needs to be more thoughtful. They need to be, founded in their principles, and also be confident in their principles, in order so that they can develop their character, become a better person, a better Eved Hashem, they become closer to God, a better husband, a better father. Okay, we get it. But if a person is going to be spending so much time studying Mussar, and spending such precious moments in, involved in the discipline of character development, then they're losing precious time from learning Torah, regular Torah, Gemara, Halacha, learning through the laws, the 613 mitzvot. What did you actually have to do? Practice, live. Okay, maybe in theory it makes sense why you have to develop as a person, but you're also losing a lot of time. So they said, so then why would Rav Yitzchak Blazer, the pre-Yitzchak, such a huge Talmud Chacham, imagine if he would have spent all that time learning Mussar, learning more halacha and more Gemara, he would have been one of the greatest of all time, even greater than what he was. He would have known even more Torah. You imagine if the pre-Yitzchak would have known even more Torah, how much more we would have? So they basically were complaining to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, stop taking Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer away from the Gemara. It's preventing him from becoming the next Gadol Hador. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter responded with a halacha in Shulchan Aruch. He used their medicine against him. He said that in Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Brachos, there is a halacha regarding, let's say a person has the option for lunch to wash for hamotzi, and they wash for hamotzi, and they have two options for bread. They either have a very, very large, think about like a chassan and kala size challah, right? Like a big challah roll, a huge, massive challah roll, the one where you walk into the bakery and it's like the one on display, a huge, huge, huge challah roll. But there's a small little piece missing. The end is cut out. As my grandmother called the end of the challah roll, the nishika, the kiss of the roll. That little tiny, the end piece, that small little end piece is cut out. You're talking about you have like a 5-pound challah with a little small piece missing, or you have the other option you're going to make hamotzi on is a small little itsy little tiny little schmeckled challah roll, a little tiny challah roll, but a full one. But it's a small little roll. So which one should a person make hamotzi on? So it says in Shulchan Aruch that shleimut, a complete roll, is better than godless, better than a large roll. Yeah, Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer could have become an even greater Talmid Chacham, an even bigger gadol, a bigger challah, a huge challah. But without Mussar, so a person isn't shalim. A person isn't shalim. A person's not complete. You're missing that shleimus. There's a lot of famous sayings and quotes from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Like he said, famously that it's more difficult to change even one character trait than to learn the entire Talmud, right? To go through the entire Talmud in depth is much easier than changing even one character trait. He used to say when someone would ask him, with my busy work schedule and family commitments and everything else in my life, I realized I only have about 10 minutes a day to learn Torah. What should I learn? Should I learn Mussar, or should I learn Gemara, or should I learn Chumash, or should I learn Halacha? So you would say, of course you should learn Mussar. Why? Because when you learn Mussar for 10 minutes a day, you'll realize that you have a lot more than 10 minutes a day to learn, right? This is Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He was always challenging a person to make sure that they actually knew what Judaism really was, what having a relationship with God really was, what being a good person really was, and challenging a person to use their mind, not just habitually. And this didn't just apply to negative things. This applies to even positive things. A person could fulfill all 613 mitzvos. A person could be could be careful down to the last detail to do everything 100% right, not make a single mistake in their life, but their whole life they never had a real relationship with God. They were just they were going through these habitual practices. They weren't bad things, they just meaningless. That a person needs to really put their mind on the ship and don't let it go along the current, go against the current, like the salmon that swim upstream. This is Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. This is an introduction to the Mussar movement. Next week, we'll talk about the different aspects of the Mussar movement, the different styles of Mussar, the different tools that were used in order to create the Mussar movement, to popularize it, and look forward to continuing in the series with everyone. I just want to thank, before we close, our sponsors. Yaakov Shore, sponsored in honor of Devorah, for being someone that always pushes him to grow in Torah. And we thank Yaakov very much. And we thank Devorah even more. Yasher Koach to both of them. And if anyone is interested in sponsoring one of the classes or a series of classes, please let me know and be happy to help you with that, and really appreciate it. All right, everyone, have a great night.
Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, I can hang on for a couple minutes.